small American town, 15 years ago. Halloween.
Hi there, I'm Ham, and I make history videos, just not the boring kind. Today we're going to be diving into some film history, and what better time to talk about the making of one of the first slasher films, John Carpenter's Halloween. So if you want to learn about Carpenter's lost student film, or which Star Wars actor was almost cast in the picture, stick around. As a child, John Howard Carpenter sought refuge in sci-fi and horror media. From the comic series Tales from the Crypt to films like It Came from Outer Space. Carpenter seemed to have a particular affinity for aliens, foreign creatures on a mysterious planet without any understanding of its culture or those who inhabit it. The experience was not unfamiliar to John, who, at the age of 5, moved from the small East Coast village of Carthage, New York, to the city of Bowling Green, Kentucky in the Jim Crow South. The move down south happened in 1953, after John's father, Howard Carpenter, accepted a music teaching position at Western Kentucky University. Howard had a PhD in music and played a variety of instruments, from the traditional violin to the contemporary bongos. Remember the bongos. They come back. While John went on to have a music career of his own, his first love was film. Carpenter began shooting his own footage at just 8 years old with a 8mm Kodak Brownie. The camera even included a splicer, allowing him to cut and join film strips together to edit footage. Later, he graduated to a German Irmig camera, which had single-frame shots for stop-motion animation. Despite supplying his son with pricey camera equipment, Howard actively discouraged John from entering the unstable field of film production. And for a while, John followed his father's advice. In 1966, he enrolled in Western Kentucky University as an English major. The year prior, John's father became head of WKU's music department. While Howard would give another 10 years to the university, John could barely muster 4 semesters. By 1968, he was neglecting his academic duties to perform paid local gigs in a rock band. It seems like this small creative success allowed Carpenter to revisit the idea of professional filmmaking. And, in the grand tradition of Hollywood hopefuls, John Carpenter moved to Los Angeles in 1968. Carpenter had good reason to feel confident about his success, having received admission into the prestigious University of Southern California School of Cinema. Established in 1929 by actor Douglas Fairbanks, USC's School of Cinema was the first film degree program in the United States. From its inception, celebrity guest speakers were a staple of the School of Cinema experience. Fairbanks used his industry connections to enlist legendary speakers, including silent film actress Mary Pickford, comedian Charlie Chaplin, and infamous director D.W. Griffith. In the late 1960s, Carpenter was one of many students crowding the lecture hall during a visit from Orson Welles. But these film legends were not confined to guests. Some of USC's biggest names were Carpenter's contemporaries, like Star Wars creator George Lucas and Back to the Future director Robert Zemeckis. With such large industry connections, University of Southern California maintains an extensive student archive. Each year, the university receives grants to preserve culturally significant media within its collection. According to campus legend, John Carpenter broke into the archives in the early 1970s and stole all the work he produced as an undergraduate. That is, until 2011, when an archivist at USC was sorting through old equipment receipts. On one of the slips, he noticed the name Carpenter alongside the title Captain Boyer. This led to the discovery of Carpenter's earliest viewable work, an 8-minute-long student film. Written and directed by John Carpenter in 1969, Captain Boyer follows an anonymous masked man who stalks sexually active youth. Sound familiar? But, unlike its successor, Captain Voyeur is a comedy. A man referred to as Captain dons underwear, a ski mask, and a cape to peep on residents of a neighboring apartment. Each unit houses some different level of sexual depravity, from an exhibitionist couple to a woman doing something questionable with a dog.
Oh, Rex, where did you ever learn that trick?
It's a funny, raunchy piece of media and a clear byproduct of the sexual revolution it was created in. I definitely recommend watching the whole thing if you can. In the shocking final, a virtuous young woman undresses in front of an open window. Upon being startled by the captain, she pulls out a gun and shoots him dead. And thus, Carpenter's first final girl was born. Carpenter made his official directorial debut at USC with Dark Star, a sci-fi comedy following a militant spaceship. He collaborated with classmate Dan O'Bannon, who later wrote genre-defining science fiction like Alien and Total Recall. John created the film's soundtrack using a module synthesizer, which quickly became his signature. But a film set entirely in outer space was an ambitious endeavor for a student project, with the production surpassing the creator's time at USC. In the spring of 1970, O'Bannon graduated from USC, while Carpenter withdrew with a single language credit remaining. This departure inspired the previously mentioned legend that Carpenter broke into the archives and stole all his work. While the discovery of Captain Voyeur dispels this myth, the provenance of Dark Star is a bit murky. I couldn't verify if USC has any footage of Dark Star in their collection. It seems likely that Carpenter and Bannon never relinquished the film in the first place, since the original non-theatrical cut wasn't finished until 2 years after their departure. Also, fun fact, Dark Star is believed to be the first depiction of hyperspace in film history. It was Carpenter's second film, Assault on Precinct 13, which served as the catalyst for Halloween. Assault on Precinct 13 was one of the many cheaply produced exploitation films of the 1970s, a genre defined by graphic depictions of sex, drugs, and violence. Assault on Precinct 13 exploits the high crime rate of the 1970s, featuring a war between gangs and the LAPD. The film includes an infamous scene where a warlord shoots a young girl dead at an ice cream truck. Adapted for modern audiences, Assault is loosely based on a 1959 Western, Rio Bravo, directed by Howard Hawks. During production, Carpenter bonded with script supervisor Deborah Hill over a shared love of the director. Before Assault, Hill worked on 2 films, Goodbye Norma Jean and Satan's Cheerleaders. While making Assault on Precinct 13, Hill and Carpenter began a romantic relationship and writing partnership. Carpenter struggled to get his violent film picked up for theatrical release. until he met Irwin Yablans. Irwin was a relatively novice producer, releasing films through his independent company. However, Irwin's brother, Frank Yablans, was the president of Paramount Pictures from 1971 to 75. To put this industry power into perspective, Frank's presidency oversaw the release of Academy Award-winning pictures like Paper Moon, Chinatown, and, oh yeah, Godfather 1 and 2. I mention this because I can't find a lot of information about Irwin's career pre-Halloween. The film was definitely a turning point for him, and he specialized almost exclusively in horror from that point on. But before meeting Carpenter, Yablans had few big productions under his belt. His spontaneous producer career likely stemmed from his brother's success. Anyway, Yablans agreed to distribute the film. Unfortunately, Assault received lackluster reviews upon US release. The picture seemed destined to slip into obscurity before it entered the European market. At the 1977 Cannes Film Festival, George Romero felt Carpenter, quote, wiped us off the face of the earth with Precinct 13. Romero attended to present his vampire horror film, Martin. After further acclaim at the London Film Festival, the picture secured British distribution, where it gained rampant popularity. The international success of Assault on Precinct 13 stirred interest in the up-and-coming director, John Carpenter, and people eagerly awaited his next film. It was Irwin Yablans who pitched the idea, which grew into Halloween. The executive producer sought a project that was cheap, easy, and profitable, and no genre fits that criteria better than horror. Since Assault demonstrated Carpenter's ability to deliver violence, Yablans approached him with the concept. He also had a working title, The Babysitter Murders. I'm glad they didn't go with that. Carpenter agreed on the condition that he maintain full creative control, receive 10% of the film's profits, and a single payment of $10,000. Once the pair learned that Halloween had never been used as a film title before, they changed the name. With the new title came a release date, October 1978, less than 6 months away. To secure funding for the project, Irwin Yablans coordinated a meeting with executive producer Mustafa Akkad. Born in Aleppo, Syria, Akkad moved to the United States to study film and television production at USC. When Akkad and Carpenter met in 1978, he had just finished directing and producing the 1976 epic The Message. The film follows the life of Prophet Muhammad through the eyes of his associates. Akkad started the project with the lofty ambition of mending relations between the West and the Islamic world. But this goal was quickly overshadowed by controversy. In October 1977, a group of Hanafi terrorists, previously part of the Nation of Islam, held a 3-day siege in Washington, D.C. The terrorists killed 2 people during the takeover, while holding 149 others captive in the district building. The group had several demands, one of which was the canceling of the U.S. premiere of The Message. They were under the false belief that the film physically depicted the Prophet Muhammad. The Message did eventually play in U.S. theaters thanks to Irwin Yablans' distribution. However, the lingering fear of violence made it a box office failure, especially in comparison to its $17 million budget. Needless to say, it was easy selling Mustafa on a quick cash grab horror film after his tumultuous experience. Carpenter's pitch was short and sweet. Quote, babysitter to be killed by boogeyman. But Akkad was suspicious of the cheap proposed budget of $300,000. With his perspective skewed by previous industry-backed projects, he doubted a quality film could be made so cheaply. In a Hail Mary effort, Yablans went for the producer's ego, assuring Akkad that there was no hard feelings if he simply couldn't afford the investment. And within that same meeting, Akkad agreed to the project. Over the next 2 weeks, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill wrote the script for Halloween. The labor was divided, with Hill writing the more realistic elements while Carpenter handled the supernatural components. Since Deborah was in her 20s and an ex-babysitter herself, she wrote the dialogue for the central friend group. Hill also gave the fictional Midwestern town its name, Haddonfield, based on her hometown in New Jersey. At least the first half of the script is confirmed written by Deborah Hill, immersing audiences in the fictional town and creating empathy for the doomed teenage girls. While creating the film's central antagonists, Carpenter drew on different inspirations. The name, Michael Myers, was a nod to the English film distributor for Assault on Precinct 13, who increased Carpenter's popularity and ultimately led to the opportunity of Halloween. The stoic physicality of Myers drew upon the 1973 sci-fi film Westworld, which featured uncanny, indestructible robot fighters. But the defining characteristic of Michael Myers, or the Shape, which he's referred to in the closing credits, is his sociopathy. Of course, watching the film today, the exaggerated fear-mongering portrayal of mental illness is a bit comical. Dr. Loomis, a supposedly licensed psychiatrist, literally diagnoses Michael as evil.
I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes. The devil's eyes.
Yet Carpenter asserts that even this aspect is based in reality, albeit slightly sensationalized. While attending Western Kentucky University, John took a social science class which included a field trip to a mental institution. Because it was the 60s, so why not? At the institution, he saw a young boy with a, quote, schizophrenic stare, which he based the demonic description of Michael on.
It's a schizophrenic stare, is what it is. It's a real evil stare, and it was unsettling to me.
In multiple interviews, Hill and Carpenter described Michael as a sociopath, a mental health disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, a void of humanity. This concept of the void is depicted through Mask, transforming Michael Myers the person into the Shape. However, Halloween also makes it a point to show that Myers is not human. With his inexplicable strength, ghostly stealth, and ability to absorb bullets, this stress on the supernatural makes Michael's psychology feel like a moot point. Now, John Carpenter deliberately wrote this contradiction into Michael's character, allowing audiences to draw their own conclusion as to what Michael Myers is. Unfortunately, trying to explain a supernatural entity with a human mental disorder only serves to villainize the disorder instead of ground the character. While the portrayal of sociopathy in the film is a bit reductive, there is no denying the result is terrifying: a human imposter. The most important casting decision of Halloween was that of vigilante psychiatrist Dr. Loomis. Hill and Carpenter wanted an established actor for the part to lend credibility to the film and draw audiences in. The role required a specific type: British, elderly, and theatrical. Originally, Carpenter wanted actor Peter Cushing to play the role of Dr. Loomis. Cushing established himself as a horror icon by playing figures like Van Helsing and Victor Frankenstein in Hammer Studio remakes. But in 1978, Cushing had just finished playing Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars A New Hope, causing his agent to reject the small film. Carpenter's alternative pick was Christopher Lee, another horror legend who played the role of Dracula alongside Peter Cushing. But Lee also rejected the offer. Years later, Deborah Hill ran into Christopher Lee at a party, where he confessed that turning down the role of Dr. Loomis was one of his biggest career regrets. After the rejections, Irwin Yablans suggested another actor, Donald Pleasence. Pleasence had also worked with Cushing and Lee. Before Halloween, Pleasence was best known for his role as Bond villain Ernest Stavro Blofeld. Pleasence accepted the part on the advice of his daughter, who was a fan of Assault on Precinct 13. Because of his resume, Pleasence earned the highest wage of all the crew, $20,000 for 5 days of filming, bringing the total budget for Halloween to $320,000. The film's main heroine was another critical casting choice. Laurie Strode had to be endearingly awkward, yet tough enough to survive the film. Audiences needed to root for Laurie or they wouldn't be invested. While Carpenter wrote the character, he had 25-year-old actress Annie Lockhart in mind. At the time, Lockhart was playing Nancy Drew in the television series The Hardy Boys' Nancy Drew Mysteries. Once she rejected the offer, production held an open casting call. When 19-year-old Jamie Lee Curtis auditioned for the part, her resume was made up of mostly brief television roles. Curtis's biggest role at the time was a reoccurring spot in the television series Operation Petticoat. The sitcom followed the antics of a World War II U.S. submarine and its cohort of attractive female nurses. The show was based on a 1950s comedy of the same name that Jamie's father, actor Tony Curtis, starred in. Despite being an unknown, affordable actress, Jamie Lee Curtis was also the product of old Hollywood royalty. Her father played alongside Marilyn Monroe in the movie Some Like It Hot. Her mother, actress Janet Leigh, starred in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. While Jamie's audition left a good impression, Carpenter and Hill both admit to hiring her mostly for the connection to Psycho. Besides Curtis, Carpenter hired actress P.J. Soles for the role of cheerleading blonde Linda. He discovered Soles from her minor parts in the 1976 horror film Carrie. John also hoped to include Soles' then-husband, Dennis Quaid, into the film. It's funny to think that in another timeline, Dennis Quaid and Christopher Lee are in Halloween. The rest of the cast was made up of relative unknowns. For the role of Laurie's friend and fellow babysitter, Carpenter casted actress Nancy Loomis, who previously worked with him in Assault. At the time of filming, Nancy was also dating Halloween production designer Tommy Lee Wallace, who she later married. Wallace was a childhood friend of Carpenter's from Kentucky, who also attended USC. The pair worked together on both Assault and Dark Star. For the majority of the film, the actor behind the Myers mask is Nick Castle. Castle is another USC alumnus, where he met Carpenter while working on the student film The Resurrection of Bronco Billy. Castle had family connections to the film industry as well. His father, Nicholas Castle Sr., was a famous old Hollywood choreographer. Nick Sr. worked with industry giants like Cab Calloway and Jerry Lewis. Following his father's footsteps, literally, Castle also trained in dance. Deborah Hill credits this dancing background for the expressive physicality and controlled movements of Michael, especially since Nick's acting was limited behind the mask. He was reportedly paid $25 a day, which is roughly $116 today. The film credits Castle for playing the Shape. In the film's opening, Michael is played by 7-year-old Will Sardine. For the point of view shots, Deborah Hill worked as the arm double for Michael, wearing the sleeve of the clown suit. Because of this, Will Sardine really only spent a couple hours on set to film the shock reveal. His main recollection of the experience was his hair getting snagged in the clown mask for each take. Sardine is credited as Michael, age 6. For unmasked adult Myers, Hill and Carpenter wanted the face to be angelic, the opposite of what someone would expect. They casted curly-haired Tony Moran for the brief cameo. While Moran had virtually no acting experience prior, his sister, Erin, played Joni on Happy Days. Moran is credited as Michael, age 23. While the casting decisions were finalized, Tommy Lee Wallace scouted for film locations in Los Angeles. It was a daunting task. The fictional Haddonfield, Illinois, was meant to be a small suburban town in the middle of autumn, the polar opposite of the metropolitan and sunny Los Angeles. To help disguise the actual filming location, Wallace sought areas with low trees to block out sunlight, settling on South Pasadena. The neighborhood had few obvious LA landmarks, though the occasional palm tree does sneak into frame. Prop leaves helped create the illusion of a Midwest autumn. The leaves were swept up and reused for each location to stay within budget. But it was the eerie, neglected residence on Meridian Ave that sold Wallace on the location. Built in 1888, the structure was a century older than its neighborhood counterparts. Deborah Hill felt the ominous symmetrical front windows mimicked a pair of eyes. Very Amityville-esque. The place was a natural haunted house and the perfect origin for Michael Myers. Besides the addition of a fallen rain gutter, the exterior of the home went largely unaltered for filming. Unfortunately, the local nursing home that owned the property was using it for storage. This meant the interior of the house had to be renovated, with the crew working meticulously to restore areas shown on camera. 2 of the 22 days of filming were dedicated to repairing the Myers house and filming the opening sequence. Most of the locations chosen were based on their proximity to the Myers house. Laurie Strode's home was only a block away. A street over is South Pasadena High School, where Laurie first spots Michael from her classroom window. Wallace opted for these close locations to lend continuity for shoe leather shots, scenes that show characters traveling between locations. An example of a shoe leather shot in Halloween is the hedge scene, where Michael waits in the bushes ahead of the walking teenagers. The moment was filmed on Montrose Ave, a realistic 20-minute walk from the school. By filming within the boundaries of a real neighborhood, Halloween firmly plants its audience in the town of Haddonfield. However, there are 2 important locations in the film that are not in South Pasadena. The babysitting houses where Annie and Laurie spend their night were located in West Hollywood. Initially, both locations were supposed to be in Pasadena, but the owner backed out last second after a misunderstanding with Wallace. Apparently, Wallace was let into the house by a maid to take measurements for filming. While doing so, he noticed a young female occupant sleeping just a few feet away from him. From the way he recalls the story, it doesn't seem like she was startled awake by him, but instead found out about his presence afterwards. Either way, the ordeal did not reflect well on the crew, and the violation cost Wallace his ideal location. Since the houses needed to be across from each other for the movie to work, losing one meant scraping the other. The crew relocated to 2 parallel homes on North Orange Grove Ave in Hollywood. The neighborhood was made up of mostly wealthy mansions, which differed vastly in size from the homes in South Pasadena. Luckily, the huge exteriors appeared smaller on film and were partially obscured by the cover of night. The remaining minor locations were shot throughout Los Angeles. The asylum scene was filmed at Lake Hollywood Drive near the Hollywood Hills, where Tommy Wallace was living at the time.
15 years
The resting
ago.
place of Michael's sister
night
was
he
at
finished
Sierra
dinner,
Madre Pioneer
and
Cemetery,
he excused himself
which
from
has
the table,
gravestones dating back
and
to the
he
19th
went out to the
century.
garage.
The payphone where Loomis calls Haddonfield police to warn about Michael's escape was in the City of Industry, Los Angeles. Wallace wanted this transitional remote area to differentiate between the suburbs and the asylum, where Michael escaped. The locational limbo reflects the unknown whereabouts of Michael. The nearby railroad track only added tension to the scene when a train unexpectedly drove by during filming. This scene also features the Phelps garage truck, whose dead driver provides Michael with his iconic jumpsuit. This truck also doubled as the craft service vehicle, providing food and drink to the crew during filming. The Halloween hair, makeup, and prop department were all confined to a single Winnebago RV. The vehicle stored the wardrobe for Laurie Strode, composed of Kmart clothes which Curtis styled herself. The clothes were kept alongside bottles of fake blood, a real kitchen knife used throughout the movie, and the original Michael Myers mask. Carpenter drew the idea of a featureless mask from the 1960 French horror film Eyes Without a Face. The film follows a disfigured young woman who wears a pale, expressionless mask to hide her injuries. The script for Halloween gives a brief abstract description of the famous prop. He wears a Halloween mask made of rubber with the grotesque features of a man. With only this to go on, Tommy Lee Wallace set out to a costume shop on Hollywood Boulevard, where he made 2 purchases. The first was a cheap plastic clown mask, which young Myers wears in the opening scene. The second was a rubber Star Trek mask of Captain Kirk, with an eerie likeness to its model, William Shatner. The mask was made by Don Post Studios and cost roughly $2 at the time. Wallace also considered using masks of Richard Nixon, Spock, and sad clown Emmett Kelly. But Shatner's was the least expressive, made even more terrifying by its resemblance to a skinned human face. To disguise the likeness to Shatner, Wallace widened the eye holes and removed the sideburns along with most of the brows. He also teased the hair and spray painted it white. With these few minor changes, Tommy Lee Wallace created one of the most recognizable figures in film. Halloween was filmed over the course of 22 days in May 1978. While still a relative beginner, Carpenter fine-tuned his techniques on previous films. The young crew was mostly made up of college kids and hippies. Donald spent the least amount of time on set, filming all his scenes in a week to accommodate his busy schedule. Most of the production was driven by this undercurrent of anxious excitement, partly due to the tight deadline. As Tommy Lee Wallace put it,
went and made the movie, and that was your life, and you ate it, drank it, slept it.
Halloween's opening scene was the most intensive to shoot. The film opens with a subjective camera shot. which is a scene filmed from a character's point of view, where the camera lens acts as eyes. Today, this trope is a staple of slasher films, in large part due to Carpenter. But the method predates Halloween. Carpenter credits 50s monster movies for his inspiration. The 1957 sci-fi picture, Beginning of the End, featured a subjective shot from the point of view of a giant locust as it flies towards a human face. The 1960 British horror film, Peeping Tom, is filled with subjective shots through the literal camera lens of the main character. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a reoccurring inspiration for Halloween, contains multiple subjective shots, including one through a peephole. And 5 years before Halloween, Steven Spielberg created his own iconic point-of-view opening through the eyes of a great white shark in Jaws. But there is a fine line between immersive and ridiculous. If Jaws is an example of a successful subjective shot, then the 1976 knockoff, Grizzly, showed Carpenter what not to do.
You will see nature's most savage man-eating animal. By its size alone, it can overpower and devour any human. Grizzly.
The film, as you may have guessed, revolves around a killer grizzly bear, with no shortage of nausea-inducing camera work and dubbed-over bear sounds. But how does a director successfully mimic the human eye? Smooth movement is essential. A common mistake filmmakers make when implementing this technique is using a handheld camera, which exaggerates movements and captures every disturbance. But this isn't how a person experiences walking. When we move, all our senses are stimulated at the same time, creating a sense of equilibrium, or feeling of balance. But when we watch shaky, handheld point-of-view shots, our eyes get told that we're moving while our body is told we're not. This miscommunication between senses lead to motion sickness. Good horror should make audiences feel sick because of the subject matter, not sloppy camera work. Carpenter hated the shaky camera work of Grizzly. He knew that part of mastering the subjective shot was a balanced camera. At the time of Halloween's creation, the traditional method of stabilizing a camera was using a dolly. A camera dolly is basically a cart that holds the camera in place while moving along a set of tracks to create smooth, fluid shots. There were two main issues with the dolly for Carpenter's purpose. First was limited mobility. The filmmaker is confined to a predetermined set of tracks, which on their own is pricey to install. The second issue was the amount of people needed to control the dolly. At the very minimum, at least 2 people are needed. A trained dolly grip or pusher to literally push the equipment, and a camera operator to pan the camera. This also requires a lot of coordination, which in turn requires a lot of time the crew did not have. But there was also a new, less established alternative. In 1975, Cinema Products Corporation released the Steadicam. Created by Garrett Brown, the Steadicam is the brand name of a camera stabilization system, worn by the operator in the form of a harness. Essentially, the camera balances on a tripod-like mount, which connects to the operator through an equipment arm attached to the Steadicam vest. The director holds the base of the camera mount in one hand and pans the camera with the other, while viewing the shot through a monitor attached to the camera stand base. The system combined all the desirable aspects of a tripod, a handheld camera, and a dolly, And, most importantly, the mount absorbed all the shock of the director's movements to produce smooth tracking shots without nauseating audiences. A year after its release, the Steadicam was used in the film Rocky. But Carpenter found inspiration in the unlikeliest of places. Exorcist II: The Heretic. The movie features a chaotic scene accomplished by Garrett Brown himself running up a ramp. Carpenter decided to use Panaglide, an alternative brand which replicated the system Steadicam pioneered. While the Panaglide allowed Carpenter control over the camera, strict coordination with the rest of the crew was required to achieve Halloween's opening shot. Deborah Hill was the arm double for Michael. She followed closely behind John, who controlled the camera. My favorite blooper in this film is the fact that Carpenter didn't account for the height discrepancy between him and a 7-year-old. So the POV shots are like at adult man height. It doesn't take away from the opening, in my opinion, it just makes me laugh. So Hill sort of hugs Carpenter from behind so that her arm matches the camera's point of view. Tommy Wallace trails closely behind with a bucket of fake blood ready to be splattered when Michael stabs his sister. And several crew members follow him with lights, adjusting the brightness to match Michael's POV. Director of photography, Dean Cudney, was crucial to lighting Halloween and several of Carpenter's other films. This was an especially difficult task for the glorified tool shed that was Michael's house. Each run-through of the opening used an entire roll of film. The final product is a combination of 3 different takes, seamlessly edited together by subtle blackouts. These lighting changes create the illusion of a single continuous shot. I think this method was also inspired by Hitchcock, who used a similar technique in his film Rope. For the shocking reveal of the child murderer, Carpenter mounted the camera on a crane, allowing viewers to float away from the scene like a ghost. Despite its bloody opening, Halloween uses very little gore throughout the film, opting for alternative methods of building tension.
I'm big on form and structure, and within a certain context doing certain things. The film I'm making now, Halloween, hopefully is a horror film, loaded with scares, suspense scares, hopefully not grisly or gory, but suspenseful, making people on the edge of their seats. I enjoy doing that.
As a nod to his love of classic sci-fi films, Carpenter felt the first victim should be a dog. The dog was a German Shepherd, though I unfortunately could not find out the name of this good boy. To film the ominous death, a trainer held the German Shepherd and let its legs drop naturally. The shot was then slowed down for the final cut, creating the illusion of the canine slowly draining of life. Another method of tension building was Carpenter positioning characters on the edges of frames. This draws audiences' attention to the empty part of the shot and creates expectation that something will happen there. For example, when Laurie discovers the bodies of her friends, she cowers in a dark corner. Carpenter wanted to create the illusion of one's eyes adjusting to darkness. For the effect, Dean Cudney used a light dimmer and slowly increased the brightness until Michael's ghostly face is revealed. Nick Castle obviously deserves a lot of credit for molding Michael into the horror icon he is today. Carpenter intentionally wrote Michael as vague as possible, hoping to avoid any personality. He also refused to explain the character to Castle. Often, the only direction was to move from point A to point B. Deborah Hill credits Castle for the iconic Myers head tilt. though this conflicts with Carpenter's recollection, where he insists that the tilt was one of the few directions he gave. The only time in the film where Castle is acting unmasked is the asylum scene, where his face is kept strategically out of view. This was also apparently the worst day of filming for him, since they were filming in the pouring rain, in 50-degree temperatures, and Castle was wearing a thin hospital gown. Donald Pleasance was another actor whose contributions changed the course of the film.
In other words, I think the script is a bit overwritten. I don't know, it's difficult to find an expression other than that, overwritten. I never quite know what it means. But I think it's a little melodramatic, and certainly in my role. But of course it's not intended to be real in that awful word realistic sense.
Originally, the script contained a scene where Loomis speaks to his wife on the phone, but Pleasance preferred that Loomis have no past. In the final scene, after Michael is shot and falls out a window, Donald suggested two ways of playing Loomis's reaction: a look of surprise or expectation, insinuating he expected Michael's survival. Carpenter chose the latter. The final shots of the film cut between various locations to the sound of Michael's heavy breathing. Deborah explained this as a way of showing audiences where Michael might be, and viewers are left to decide if Michael is a man or a boogeyman. While Hill claims a sequel was never planned or intended, it's clear the ending is ripe for another installment. Though filming wrapped in May, Carpenter had little time to rest. In June 1978, he began to score Halloween at the Sound Art Studio in central LA. Assault on Precinct 13 was actually scored in a single day, serving as a trial run for Halloween. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Shortly before recording, John had screened the unscored picture to an executive at 20th Century Fox. The employee bluntly told him the movie was not scary. With no time to reshoot, the soundtrack had to be the film's saving grace. So he drew inspiration from some of the scariest movies he knew: The Exorcist and Dario Argento's Suspiria, both of which featured progressive rock themes with synthesizers. Carpenter is humble regarding his music talent.
How did that?
Well, I compose because I'm cheap and I'm fast, and we just didn't have any money for a composer. And
the rhythm for the main score was inspired by a 5/4 time exercise John's father taught him while learning the bongos. I told you not to forget them. Did you remember? Basically, a 5/4 time is when the beats are an odd number, therefore cannot be divided into a bar. I just Googled it. Since the primitive synthesizers of the 1970s only held single-track recordings, the machines had to be reset between each recorded element and layered in post-production. To manage this complex recording system, Carpenter called upon his former USC professor, Dan Wyman. Wyman pioneered the use of machine synthesizers in the film industry. He briefly worked with composer David Shire on the soundtrack for Apocalypse Now, which was originally meant to be entirely performed on synthesizers. However, Coppola scraped the idea due to a personal grievance with Shire, though the unused synth scores were released in 2017. But Dan Wyman's most recognizable work would be produced in collaboration with Carpenter. John credits Weinman as co-producer of the Halloween soundtrack, aiding in programming synths and tricky chords. Miraculously, Carpenter composed the film's score in double-blind mode, that is, without syncing the music to the scenes. He raw-dogged that soundtrack. He also incorporated stings. Stings are sharp, unsettling music notes which work as an emotional cue for the audience. You might recognize this one, a sound that accompanies glimpses of Michael throughout the film. While Halloween was in the final edits, producers Irwin Yablans and Joseph Wolf searched for a film distributor. They assumed the film's commercial appeal would lead to a negative pickup. This is when a major studio buys an independent film to overtake the release and production for a share of the profits. However, Halloween was rejected by every major studio it was brought to. The film had to be self-distributed. Luckily, Joseph Wolf had a contact in MGM Studios. The mystery person secured him 400 prints of the film, reducing a fraction of the distribution cost. Yablans then released the picture through his studio, Compass International. Before bringing the film to the public, Carpenter gave an exclusive early screening to his alma mater at USC. If the young crew expected a warm reception, they were deeply disappointed. The students reportedly devoured the film, with one of them asking Carpenter why he bothered to make it in the first place. The crew explained the work as an attempt to breathe new light into the horror genre, which the students mocked relentlessly. Wolf attended a different screening at UCLA and estimated a 35% walkout. Initially, the critics were just as unenthusiastic. Halloween premiered in Kansas City on October 25, 1978. Afterwards, it circulated through Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. Many of the original reviews were negative, with some criticizing the film's low budget and lack of scares. A lot of these reviews reflect a disdain for the horror genre itself. Variety magazine disregarded the picture as, quote, just another maniac on the loose suspenser, end quote. It wasn't until the film's opening at the Chicago Film Festival that critical acclaim began to pour in. In the Chicago Sun-Times, film reviewer Robert Ebert referred to Halloween as, quote, a visceral experience. We aren't seeing the movie, we're having it happen to us. Carpenter traces the tide change to a rave review in the Village Voice, which compared the picture to Psycho and Carpenter to Hitchcock. You just know John Carpenter was kicking his feet in the air reading that comparison. In the end, it was really the audience that made Halloween a success. While the initial release was slow, the film gained traction through word of mouth. This was especially important since the film lacked industry backing and had little advertising. Carpenter attended a New York showing of the film, where he heard audiences' screams from outside the theater. Hill remembers the film's cult following mirroring that of Rocky Horror. Audience members watched Halloween several times in theaters, timing collective chants of, "Don't go in there," and often quoting PJ Souls' catchphrase of,
"Totally."
Since the fictional Haddonfield shares a name with a real New Jersey town, the movie inspired rumors that it was based on true events. The main complaint regarding the film was its seemingly conservative agenda. It's a common trope in horror films that sex equals death. Sexually active teens are almost always killed shortly after, but Carpenter refutes having any conservative intention, viewing the film as a revenge of the repressed instead of a condemnation of sex. He says the only reason promiscuous characters die is because they are distracted. The $320,000 picture would amass $70 million worldwide in its initial release. Carpenter was lucky to be well compensated, since his contract included 10% of the film's profits. Of course, with such a successful blockbuster, a sequel was inevitable. Mustafa Akkad agreed to the sequel with Universal Studios. Both Carpenter and Hill returned for the production of Halloween 2. Halloween 2 is also the last film in the franchise for which Carpenter wrote the script. He admits to doing so with the help of a nightly six-pack of Budweiser. The sequel is also the last film in the series to feature the original Shatner mask, despite looking very different. Apparently, Nick Castle often folded the prop and kept it in his pocket between takes. The item further deteriorated in Deborah Hill's apartment, where it turned yellow from cigarette smoke. The prop looked even worse, since the actor in the sequel had a wider face than Nick Castle, so Michael looks kind of swollen the whole movie. He needs to gua sha. I love the sequel. The fact that it's supposed to take place the same night as the original kinda insinuates the first movie ends at like 8:30. Like, there are still kids trick-or-treating in the second movie. The sequel also gave us this incredible scene. NBC purchased the rights to Halloween's TV release, despite the film being a few minutes shy of the minimum TV runtime. Since production on the sequel had already began, Carpenter used the reassembled cast to extend the film for television. He calls these frivolous additions carpet scenes, which includes a monologue from Loomis opposing Michael's parole in court. While Deborah Hill and John Carpenter ended their romantic relationship shortly after Halloween, the pair continued to collaborate professionally on films like The Fog and Escape from LA. John Carpenter, Nick Castle, and Tommy Lee Wallace briefly formed a new wave band called the Coupe de Villes. The group created the album Waiting Out the 80s and the soundtrack to Big Trouble in Little China. As a result of Halloween's success, there was an increase in holiday-themed scary movies. By 2013, Halloween had made John Carpenter $47 million, and this was before the most recent revival with Jamie Lee Curtis. In 1988, the city of South Pasadena deemed the Myers house a historical landmark. To save the building from demolition, it was relocated from Meridian Ave to 1000 Mission Street, where it remains a pilgrimage site for dedicated fans to this day. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much if you made it this far. I know this was a very long video. I realized it as I was reading the script out loud. But I really appreciate anyone who made it to the end. So thank you, and stick around for the next one. Bye.